during that session. Throughout his tenure, he has commanded the respect and admiration of his House colleagues as well as everyone else who has worked with him on various issues. We will certainly miss him next session, as he has announced that he will not run for re-election to his House seat, but we are honored to have him with us here this morning.
John, thank you as always for being back again with us this year. I'll say usually when we put you in the hot seat, you seem a little stiff and tense, but you seem relaxed and smiling and enjoying yourself this year. Is something going on?
Not much.
Well, you will be missed, but we do appreciate your being with us today.
While you're saying that, let me say something since I probably won't be back up here. Throughout my 6 terms in the Texas House, 4 years on Ways and Means, 5 years on appropriations, I want to thank this organization for having staff and people here that members like me can come to and get unspun information and facts without the political spin. You don't know how valuable that is. Not all of us have a long history here. One of the things we're probably going to talk about today is something I came to Dale to talk about on the creation of the rainy day fund and the funds consolidation, and we'll get into that a little later. But I just want to thank you. I have encouraged all of my colleagues in the House that, look, we have in-house help with LBB, people that we trust and go to, but when you need to go to somebody on the outside of the Pink Dome, this is the organization I tell them they need to come talk to. So I personally want to thank y'all for being there as a resource and helping us.
Thank you. Very much appreciated. And just for that, I'll take out question 7. But, well, and you have been fabulous to work with, and we have been pleased to see you advance in the House. And this past session, you chaired the Appropriations Committee and took over the budget in probably good times. But right now, it does appear that the budget is balanced with money to spare. What do you see as you look back on this session as the fiscal highlights of not only the budget, but the overall fiscal package itself?
Well, you're right. When we came into session, we did have money. I think that kind of worried members because we were hearing the oil price discussions that Comptroller Hager referred to before we got out of there in May. So there was obviously a little angst in the room on, okay, just how accurate is this revenue estimate that we have? But the things that I probably, once I was announced as chair of appropriations, I sat down and made a list. And it's surprising, Comptroller Hager mentioned the balance sheet items. And those were most of the items that were on my list. And the things that the House addressed in their budget, such as the ERS pension system. I mean, that was a gaping hole of $500 million a year we were going in the red. And with the fix that was put into place of increasing the contribution rates, it got it out to actuarial soundness slightly over the 31-year measuring stick that everybody uses. We're at 32, 33. But my gosh, we can now see a light at the end of the tunnel. And you know, I would say that was probably one of the major accomplishments in the budget this last time. Also, our retired teachers. You know, we were looking at a $760 million shortfall just to keep the benefits where they were and the premiums where they were on the retired teachers' health insurance. I spoke to retired teachers up in Walker County the other day, and I mentioned to them, it just happened that the way that we came up with the idea to how are we going to pay for this was, okay, appraisals came in 2015 about $700 million more than what we had originally estimated in the previous budget. So typically the state takes that money and says, okay, that's $700 million we weren't going to have to put into public education because local values increased so much. The idea that I visited with my subcommittee on was, let's keep this money in education by funding retired teachers on their health insurance. Here's the thing. What I didn't want to see happen last session was, let's go in and make design changes in the plan, raise the premiums, and we don't know what health insurance is going to look like 2 years from now, and we may have to change it again. So let's tread water for 2 years and try to keep them where they are, fully telling them it's going to change, and we all know it. Our health insurance is going to change. We just don't know how. So that was some of the, those right there. Another accomplishment, and this doesn't get talked about that much, but in 2012, Speaker Joe Strauss said, we used through funds consolidation $5 billion of dedicated balances to balance our budget, to certify it. He said, that's not very transparent, and when you think about it, you shouldn't even be doing it because that money is dedicated to be spent for a specific purpose. You can't use it like you do freed up general revenue, but that's how we're treating it when we send the bill over to the comptroller. So he said, we need to start weaning ourselves off of that. Chairman Darby and I, for the last 2 sessions, have carried House Bill 6 and House Bill 7 to wean the state off of those balances so that they are not used for certification. In 2013, we got it down to just slightly over $4 billion. Last session, we got it under $3 billion. That we're using those balances to certify the budget. We also started utilizing those funds for the purpose for which they were collected, or lowering the fee if we're collecting too much. So those are the kinds of things, obviously in the fiscal, the tax cuts were important, but in the House we have 2 different committees, whereas in the Senate Finance does all of that. In the House, all I had to make sure of is when my committee was working on the budget, that we were leaving enough room for the tax reductions that were being discussed. So we just had a dollar amount that I had to sort of put in reserve and say, okay, we're not going to spend this money because it's going to be given back in some method to taxpayers. So we didn't have a big play over in appropriations about that. I think that's pretty much, and you're right, we did not spend all of the money. Probably in hindsight, that's probably a good thing with the revenue estimate after certification that came out. I think the number I saw was $4.4 billion in balances that's currently now projected at the end of the current biennium. What's important in that though is out of that $4.4 billion, 3.7 of that is dedicated. That means you've got $700 million of general revenue. Today is the best estimate. That's your balance. I think people need to keep paying it. I keep ringing that bell because you need to pay attention to that. That's why we need to get off of those balances being used to certify the budget, so we get a true picture of what revenue we do have to spend.
Well, there were some accomplishments, but over the summer we did see some stories about some unfinished business, particularly I think we saw in the news concerns about the Racing Commission, issues over their funding. Could you talk a little bit about the status of that?
Sure. The Senate zero funded the Racing Commission in their budget. They did not fund the agency. The House did. When we got to conference on the budget, the resolution of that was to put a rider to fund the Racing Commission, but to put a rider in there. The Senate had some concerns about what the commission did with regards to historic racing. They thought that was an expansion of gaming that was not authorized under the current law, and they have every right to call into question. I know they held hearings. The House did not, to my knowledge. So the rider was put in there that funding on the administrative side of the commission could have to come before the OBB for approval. Shortly after we got out, when the new fiscal year started, the Senate wanted to invoke that rider. We had discussions. They wanted a 90-day, in other words, we'll fund you for 90 days and then take a look at it. I was in favor of funding the budget, but I said, look, 6 months I can live with. It's hard, in my opinion, if you've got an agency out there, how do you plan when all you know you've got certainty for is 90 days? We're having that same discussion right now because that 90 days is up at the end of November. So we've got to make a decision, okay, what do we do now? This is all intermixed with the fact that there are also 3 appointees that are up to the commission by the governor's office. That's going to have a say in this. So right now, we're in discussions about, okay, do we do another 90 days or do we do 6 months?
Okay. And another issue that's come up is Medicaid funding for children's therapy.
That issue was, there are riders in the budget that instruct Health and Human Services to try to make savings in our Medicaid population. That is a worthy goal. The problem is sometimes it gets interpreted that there are fixed amounts that have to be saved regardless of what the impact would be on access to care by the people that are served and what the impact would be on the people that are providing those services. So I think we have finally put the last letter I saw signed by Lieutenant Governor Patrick and Senator Nelson, that we're all pretty much in agreement that these reductions are not to have an impact on access to care in the children's therapy services. That was where the main issue was that was driving that.
Okay. And this was your first session chairing appropriations. It was Senator Nelson's first session, although she took over in the interim. And we did have a number of new faces in both the House and the Senate.
Well, I had all brand new subcommittee chairs. They'd never been a subcommittee chair before.
And that makes it difficult to put together a consensus budget to educate members and get something passed. Near the end of the session, as you all were sort of working in the back rooms, our phones are ringing at our offices. People are calling, are they going to get this done? Where are they? I hear it's all falling apart. So share with us now from the back rooms. Was there ever a time when you thought this was not going to get done and we were going to have a special session?
The budget or the tax cuts?
The whole package. Were you at any point in danger of ruining my wife's summer?
Looking back, no, I don't think so. I mean, I will tell you, Senator Nelson and I, we kind of laughed when we heard those rumors. We didn't see any problem in Congress in getting a budget to the floor in plenty of time. There were times, and again, I was divorced from all the conversation that was going on about the tax reductions.
Divorced is actually a good word to use when you talk about a legislative special session.
So I wasn't probably as up to date about what the discussions were. I heard the same discussions y'all were hearing, because there was a disagreement in approach initially on how we're going to lower taxes. So, you know, but I don't think I ever seriously doubted that we would get done before in the regular session.
Now, you talked a little bit about the fact that you did leave some cash in general revenue, over $4 billion. What we don't always mention in that discussion is the fact that there's over $10 billion in the rainy day fund. So right now, the state effectively has a $14 billion cash cushion, which is the equivalent of, you know, roughly 25 to 30% of any year's general revenue spending. I mean, have we gotten to a point where maybe we're setting aside too much?
It's an interesting conversation, and now I can go back and talk about my bill that I wished I had gotten passed, but I didn't. Unfinished business that hopefully somebody next session will pick up. When the Economic Stabilization Fund, Rainy Day Fund, was originally created, it was created with a cap that said it is measured on the deposits into general revenue. That's the way it's described in the Constitution. And basically, I think it's 10% of whatever is deposited into the general revenue fund. So that was what was put into law. And Rainy Day Fund didn't get much money early on, folks. It never really had much of a balance, and when it did, we usually spent it all in my early sessions there. It's only in the recent history that we have built these huge balances, and primarily because oil prices were where they were for so long. After that happened is the invention of something called funds consolidation. Funds consolidation was taking all funds and moving it into general revenue so it could be counted for certifying the budget. What I alluded to earlier about those dedicated general revenue funds. Well, included in that is federal funds, federal money, which has grown to such a significant number and amount that to make that calculation today The cap on the rainy day fund is between $14 and $15 billion before you spill over. If you go back and exclude federal money, which in my opinion should never be, it was never intended in the original bill to be included, because they were not depositing federal money into the general revenue fund back when they passed that bill. If you were to take that away, the new cap would be between 10 and 11 billion. So we would begin to have spillover shortly of general revenue freed up. And I had a bill that would say that money should be used to pay down debt. I was also agreeing that the Texas Tomorrow Fund is something I consider debt that we need to shore up. The other thing that now has since occurred is you're going to need, some of that one-time money when things go bad and you don't have the revenue coming in that you need. But I thought what I thought was most important is, one, let's restore the cap on the rainy day fund to what was originally intended in law, and two, so that we don't have to wait till it gets to 14 billion, which will take, I think it may take years, a decade to get there. The other thing, and you're just sitting on a balance of money when you've got needs in this state, like the infrastructure. And then, you could utilize that. I didn't want to see that spillover, when it does occur, go in to build the ongoing expenditures of the budget, because you can't count on that revenue stream. It's not dependable. So therefore, let's put in the statute or in the Constitution what that money can be used for when it spills over. Otherwise, if you let it alone and somebody comes along with a nice new program, or I want to enhance this, that's fine. You got the spillover. What happens when the spillover doesn't occur next biennium? It's not a reliable stream. So that's, I agree with you. The rainy day fund, I think the most important thing is we need to go back and get federal dollars out of that calculation. We shouldn't be doing that.
Well, and while we're on that, I'll offer one observation, in that we always think of the rainy day fund as providing a cushion in those times when we're in fiscal duress. But we also just came through a cycle where the controller cut $4 billion from the revenue estimate, but the net effect on general revenue was only a couple of $100 million, because most of that $4 billion was going into the rainy day fund. So a part of what the rainy day fund does is it also takes away money in times of prosperity, so that it does not create this unfunded obligation in the budget that could drop with
You're right. With the oil and gas severance tax, which is the primary funding mechanism for that, you're right. When the economy's doing well, do you really want to build a budget based on those dollars that are going into the rainy day, when we just see what happened again? And
Schlueter will probably call you later today and tell you he was right.
You'll have to fill me in on that.
That was one of his points when he passed the rainy day fund originally. But I want to ask you the same question that I asked the controller this morning, and it deals with the November ballot proposition that effectively we're going to dedicate roughly $5 billion a biennium of current general revenue and put that into highways. It's sort of, we've had a lot of talk over the last several years, are we diverting highway dollars to general revenue? Now we seem to be doing a reverse diversion from general revenue to highways. But $5 billion is a lot of money. I mean, as you look at the long-term fiscal outlook for the state, is that amendment affordable?
That's a good question, and I don't think we know the answer to that yet. I'm supporting the proposition because transportation is so important. Would I have rather seen a user fee used as opposed to dedicating general revenue? Yes, but politically that wasn't going to happen. And you can't ignore the problem that transportation needs the dollars. So that's the deal. The real concern I have is this. Serving on appropriations for, 5 years, what I've learned is we have gotten to the point that it's common knowledge by those of us that serve on appropriations that we only have discretion today over about 17% of all the money that is spent. Now you may ask, well, 17%, that's all? Yeah, the other 83% is either dedicated by Constitution, by formula, by statute, by federal match. So when I walk into Austin, I've got all this money, oh, but wait a minute, I only get to really use 17% how I want to use it, or how my committee wants to use it. The other is spoken for. We really don't have a choice. I'm going to be curious to see what LBB tells me when this goes into effect, and this is my but. Again, I'm not saying we shouldn't have done it, but I think we need to be aware that we have now just dedicated, and it's hard to undo something once you put it in the Constitution, which is the reason that the dial back to 50% that's one of the reasons it got my vote on the floor, was they did put some flexibility into this to allow the legislature with a supermajority vote to dial that $2.5 billion a year back in hard times. But how much discretion did we just take away from the legislature? That's a concern. And I think that's something we need to be looking at and considering as we go forward and how we're going to address that. I agree totally with what the core functions are that we need to be funding. The thing we need to be very careful about is if we leave a revenue, our revenue stream is sales tax, folks. That's the GR we use to spend. When you start doing that kind and that amount of dedication, I do have some concerns about will it work in the future.
Well, and another tax that comes up that is often identified with you is the margin tax, because as a freshman, you were actively engaged in.
I was only asked to explain it.
I understand it. But you were the only one who really knew what they were voting on. But, and in truth, y'all were brought a bill. It was written by John Sharp and the Blue Ribbon Panel.
Now, this was about the third bill, by the way.
Yes.
Third special session.
And you didn't really have a chance to restructure the tax. But now we've had the margin tax for some time. As you look back on the experience, as you look at the tax that exists today, any parting thoughts about the margin tax?
Oh, 20/20 hindsight's always wonderful. Here's the thing. You were never going to get the property tax relief that the legislature wanted to give back then, which was, think about it, it was a 1/3 reduction in the maintenance and operation rate of school districts. You heard the cost, $7.1 billion a year. I mean, think about that. We went from a $1.50 cap down to $1, and we allowed districts to get 4 pennies with no vote of the voters, enriched at Austin ISD value. This lawsuit in Austin has some ramifications to the state, folks, if they're successful, because all our school districts are going to benefit by the values in Austin ISD, and the state will have to equalize those pennies if that is a successful lawsuit. But that was the question. Looking back, if I had to do it all over again, because, and learning what I learned, and Bonin pointed this out very correctly, we lowered taxes by 1/3 and got no credit for it. Because within 2 years, appraisals had eaten it up. I mean, I don't know how many people we lowered go take your tax statement with this new appraisal and add 50 cents to the rate. That's what it would have been if we hadn't done this. That doesn't sell too well. All they see is, this is what I paid last year, this is what I'm paying this year. Looking back, we actually had another option. We could have just raised the cap from $1.50 to about probably $1.65 and not had to do anything to the franchise tax. And then 5 years later, when the school districts were all at $1.65 and suing us again, we could have gone to $1.80. To put local discretion. At what point do you end up with a revolt? How high does it have to get? What we did was to get it down to $1.50, and if you want to go up another 17 cents, each time you do that, you got to have a vote of the voters. Your voters now have to approve it. They have to have buy-in. From that standpoint, I like what we did. The question is, should we have gone for the full 50 cents? 20/20 hindsight says we probably should have retained the old net income approach on the franchise tax, but brought everybody in that got liability protection, so that everybody that was getting that protection got treated the same. One of the thoughts I had when we reduced the rate 25% is, what would the fiscal note be to go back to the old franchise tax, but keep everybody under the tent that's currently paying? Because you get rid of a lot of the complaints that I hear in that there's 2 rates, SIC code, determines, even though I may be competing with somebody, and I have to pay it if I have a loss. All right? Which, remember, under the old franchise tax, you had to pay it if you had a loss, if you were capital intensive. So that wasn't going to let everybody out. But, it's nice to sit here and say, well, what would I have done differently? Unless you experience those things, I guess the thing to do is learn from history. And don't make the same. I agree totally with what Chairman Bonin had to say, is the state cannot control what locals are going to tax at. And I'm not sure we ought to be trying. People need to be engaged at the local level. When we lowered the tax rate, if you'll go back and look, when we lowered it from $1 to $1.50 to $1, go back and look and see how many school districts held bond elections for new buildings that year. Because they can clearly make the statement, if it's only going up 10, 15 cents, you're still going to get a tax reduction if you vote for these bonds. So once again, we sort of, we step in it thinking we can help at the local level, and they're smarter than we are.
I want to close with a question that I have been wanting to ask you for years.
As long as it's not about A&M.
Now, but now that you're in a position where you can't really hurt me anymore, I'll go ahead and but you were elected as a conservative Republican. You had experience, political experience before that, but not at the State House. What about the process has surprised you? Has it changed? What are your thoughts now as you look back at the legislature as a body, and how you participated in?
First of all, it was probably the greatest experience I've ever had in my life. People don't know how special this place is, especially the House, because that's the only place I've been. I've got relationships and friendships that I would not have had, that I will have for a very long time when I leave here, that are just, you can't put a value on that. I served on city council, I served on school board. School board's a lot harder than this. Let me tell you, because you're dealing with kids and parents. And the institution has changed. Obviously, people ask me, well, why did you decide to leave now? You didn't announce it at the end of session. I said, well, two things. One, I was planning on coming back. Hell, I'm chairing the budget. How about, what else? That's something that was on my bucket list once I arrived here, was either chair Ways and Means or chair Appropriations. But the last two primary seasons have not been fun. And I made the statement, when this thing ceased to be fun, it was time to get out. And that concerns me, because I'm watching a lot of my friends go through the same thing. And I think we as a state better wake up, or we're not going to be able to attract good people to come serve. So I would say that, that's the one change I don't like, what I'm seeing. But the people that I serve with, they're great. And folks, Washington, D.C. should work like this House and this Senate works. We get a lot more done. When we get there, yeah, you run as a Republican, you run as a Democrat, but I'm proud of every Democrat on my Appropriations Committee. They helped me get that bill passed on the House floor 141-5. You don't do that without working together. And that's what concerns me, is we've got to keep that in Texas.
Thank you very much. You have been an absolute pleasure to work with over the years. This is very special and forward.
John, you have spent over a